Jewish personalities. Tonight we're talking about Rabbi Judah the Prince. He was a student of the previous two personalities, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Meir, amongst many other rabbis. He went and studied by all the rabbis of his time. And we learned something very interesting about him from the very beginning of his life. He was born on the very same day that Rabbi Akiva was brutally and heinously killed and murdered by the Romans. And the verse tells us, "V'zarach Hashem u'shubah Hashem," that when the sun sets, it sets over here, but it rises elsewhere. So the son, Rabbi Akiva, who gave Torah and light to the Jewish people, when his sun set, a comparable son in the form of Rabbi Judah the Prince arose as well. And it's interesting, or it's not surprising, because the impact that Rabbi Judah the Prince is going to have on the Jewish people and the continuity of Torah is going to be on par with Rabbi Akiva. Of course, Rabbi Akiva gave us all of Torah because he was the last link, he was the last rabbi standing, and his students were the ones who built the oral Torah and codified it. But Rabbi Judah the Prince is going to have a very important impact on Torah that really made sense to put him along this same line. If you remember, Rabbi Akiva died at the height of the Shmad, of the Hadrianic persecution, where they were killing rabbis and banning all forms of Torah. And one of the things that they prohibited was circumcision, bris milah. So there's an interesting story about Rabbi Judah the Prince. When he was a little baby, they circumcised him against Torah law. And the Romans found out. They found out that his family, which was the family of the prince, they were the political and spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, they had a new baby and they circumcised the baby. So they brought him to Rome, and the rules were that they were going to execute the mom and the baby. So they brought him to Rome, and on the way, his mother and with the new baby stopped off at an inn, and she met a Gentile family. And they became friendly with the Gentile family, and she told her family. She's going to Rome now, because they're going to inspect to see the new baby, if the baby's circumcised, and they're going to murder the baby. Now, this woman, this family that they met, they also had a little baby. And she said, you know what, why don't we propose a deal? They swapped babies. So Rabbi Judah the Prince is with this Roman family. The Roman baby, uncircumcised, he comes with the mom of Rabbi Judah the Prince. And she tends to him along the way. They come to Rome. She shows the baby. Baby's uncircumcised. They don't touch her or the baby. She brings him back, and they swap him back. And this child grows into becoming the famous Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who is going to be very close friends with Rabbi Judah the Prince. They're going to become colleagues. They're going to become friends in scholarship as well. And they're going to together really help building the next frontier of Jewish life. Antoninus himself, he's going to study Torah with Rabbi Judah the Prince. He's going to convert as well, and ultimately he's going to end up circumcised as well. Now, why is he called Rabbi Judah the Prince? So prince is an official terminology. It was an office. The first prince we have is Hillel. Hillel is the great-great-great-grandfather of Rabbi Judah. And Hillel's descendants all held the title of prince. And this is from the Davidic line. They all came from the Davidic line, from the house of David. And Hillel's son was Rabbi Gamliel. His son was Rabbi Shimon. His son was also Rabbi Gamliel. His son was Rabbi Shimon. His son is Rabbi Judah. And on. For hundreds of years, the official office, the official leader, political and spiritual leader of the people is the Nasi, the prince, also alternatively the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the court, and they played a very important leadership role at a time where leadership was sorely lacking amongst the Jewish people. So he's called Rabbi Judah the Prince. Now he was also inordinately wealthy. The Talmud tells us that since Moses, there was no one like him who was such a leader, who had such disparate qualities. He was the richest person around, the greatest Torah scholar around, the most gifted in every way, the most pious, him, and therefore, and what it's doing there essentially is comparing the accomplishments of Rabbi Judah the Prince to that of Moses. And we'll see that's not so outrageous to suggest. And he, because of all these capabilities and these skills, we'll get to the questions at the end. He was uniquely positioned to really achieve a major innovation that essentially saved the Jewish people. We know that Torah was under assault. That's been the theme of the past couple of weeks. Rabbi Akiva was at the end of it. End of his life is where it really picked up in ferocity. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, they rise to prominence when Torah was, at its most vulnerable state. And the truth is that over history, Torah was always under a threat, at least, of continuance. There was never a guarantee that the Jewish people will be able to study unmolested. And Rabbi Judah the Prince, his most dramatic accomplishment is that he is going to really give the Jewish people a moat, a security blanket, to ensure that no matter how bad things get over the course of their history, they'll have his contribution to ensure that Torah will continue on. And this hinged essentially, or it was conditional as well on his relationship with Antoninus. So remember, they were friends, or they had an interaction as babies, but in the year 161, so this is about 25 years after the death of Rabbi Akiva, and that's the age of Rabbi Judah the Prince at the time, he's about 20, 25 years old, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus becomes emperor of Rome. And there was a little window here, a little window from Roman hostilities, because he was very friendly to the Jewish people, and he was very friendly with Rabbi Judah the Prince, that really allowed major developments to happen very, very fast. And he himself, Antoninus, was a really remarkable person, like we mentioned, a benevolent and friendly leader to the Jewish people. But he is considered, or he's presented as the ideal manifestation of Esau. Next week's parsha, we're going to read about Jacob and Esau. Jacob, Yaakov, and Esau. And we know that Jacob is the family of the Jewish people, and Esau is his foe. But did Esau have to be evil? No. He could have been great. He chose, to whatever degree, but he chose to not become as great as he could have become. But what would be Esau in his most ideal representation? What would it look like, the relationship of Judah, of the Jewish people of Israel and Esau? What would that look in its most ideal scenario? It would be Rabbi Judah the Prince, and Antoninus. In fact, if you look at Rashi, when Rashi describes the interactions that Jacob and Esau had in utero, so Rebekah went to visit with the prophet, and the prophet told her, there's two nations in your belly, and the way nations is spelled, two proud ones. There's two proud ones in your destiny. Who are these two proud ones? Says Rashi, Zerebi Vantoninus. This is Rabbi Judah the Prince, and Antoninus. Antoninus is someone who really represented what Esau could have become. He could have been a colleague and a friend and a contributor to Torah. And indeed, in a certain degree, it was actualized in Antoninus, but Esau did not necessarily have to go on a path towards total evil. Now, Marcus Aurelius himself was a really remarkable individual and a philosopher, and in fact, even Roman sources describe him as the king who was the philosopher, contemporary sources. And the Talmud records a tremendous series of events, a series of debates and discussions that Rabbi Judah the Prince had with Antoninus. And this in itself is noteworthy because the Talmud doesn't quote Torah from non-Jews. It doesn't happen in the Talmud. But there's a whole series of philosophical and theological debates that the Talmud brings between Rabbi Judah the Prince and Antoninus. And in some of them, when they had an argument, Antoninus was right, which really shows the kind of stature we held, the Jewish people held for him. So first one here, Antoninus asked Rabbi's Rabbi Judah the Prince, we'll see that's his nickname. He asked them like this, body and soul. So they get separated at death. And we believe that there's judgment. If someone sins, they're going to have to answer for their sins. Says Antoninus, I have a loophole. I'll solve the problem. Why? They can each, body and soul, can each self-exonerate. The body will say, it wasn't me that sinned, it was the soul that sinned. You know why? Ever since we're separated, I'm sitting in the grave like an immovable rock. Clearly, I'm not the one that sinned, it was the soul that sinned. And the soul can say, it wasn't me that sinned, it was the body that sinned, because ever since we've been separated, I'm floating like a bird. I'm totally useless. So Antoninus is asking Rabbi Judah the Prince, how could the Almighty ever pin a person for their misdeeds? How can there be any judgment? Because you take apart a human, body and soul, you separate them, and each one of them can deflect the criticism for their deeds, for their misdeeds, on the other one. And conversely, each one of them cannot be rewarded for their positive deeds, because each one of them can claim that they did it because the other one's not doing any positive deeds without them. That was his question. The Gemara records this in the book of Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Judah the Prince responds, I'll give you a parable. What is this comparable to? It says there's a king, and the king has a beautiful orchard full of luscious fruits, and he commissions 2 guards to watch it for him. One of the guards is blind, and one of the guards is lame. And he says, you guys are together in charge, make sure nothing happens to those beautiful fruits. And the king leaves, and they're sitting there, the blind guardsman and the lame guardsman, the cripple, and the lame guard says to the blind one, he says, now look what I see, these beautiful, luscious fruits. Let's make a deal, let's make a pact. You'll give me a ride, give me a piggyback ride, I'll go on your shoulders. And you're blind, but you can walk fine, and I'll direct you where to go. We'll take all the fruits and we'll eat them. Fine. So the cripple climbs on the back, and he hobbles along, and eventually they eat all the fruits. And then they go back, and they're hanging out in the grass, and the king comes back, and he looks at his orchard, and he says, wait, where's my fruits? I told you guys to watch the fruits. So the cripple says, look at me, I can't walk. Obviously it was the blind guy. And the blind guy says, I'm blind. Obviously it was the cripple. So what does the king do? The king he takes the cripple. He once again puts it on the piggyback of the blind guy, and he doesn't judge them as 2 separate, distinct entities. He judges them as one. So too, says Rabbi Judah the Prince, the Almighty is going to take the soul, thrust it back into the body, and judge someone as one. It's just a beautiful story and a beautiful example, beautiful parable in this debate that existed here between Rabbi Judah the Prince and Antoninus. And I think there's some really nice lessons just for us in life from this construct. First of all, I think a lot of people erroneously believe that in life we're tasked with achieving something that's beyond us. You know, we're born and we're put into the world, and we don't know anything. And there's something that we need to get, something we need to accomplish, and we need to pursue and achieve it. Here, in this example of Rabbi Judah the Prince, he's telling us, no, you have the orchard already. The fruits are already there. Your job is just to maintain status quo, just to preserve what you already have, not to pursue what you don't have. Which to me is always, it's very heartwarming, because it's frustrating to think that there's something there that we need to do, and we don't know what it is, and it's so complicated, and so many mitzvahs, and what's the distilled version of our life mission? And here we go. We have a distilled version of our life mission. Preserve the proverbial fruits. Don't sin, i.e. Now what that means, maybe we'll see in the next example. But that's a remarkable lesson. And I think it's cheerful to think that we don't need to accomplish anything. We just need to make sure we don't regress. Number one. Number two, I think there's another remarkable lesson here. What he's telling us is that judgment happens when body and soul are reunited. But what is this reunification of body and soul? In life, we have the cripple, and he's on the back of the blind guard. And in judgment, it's the same thing. It's almost the body and soul are married in life. They get separated at death, and they get remarried again at judgment. But that's not Olam Haba. That's not resurrection. Resurrection is an entirely new recreation of man, not soul being in a body host, rather built out of the soul a new entity, where soul is dominant and body is just there. And I think it's very interesting the way he presents it. He says, body and soul were together, they were undone, and we just put them back together in the same way. We take the soul and throw it back in the body. Whereas Olam Haba, that's not judgment. That's for tzaddikim, and that is a total recreation, an entirely new paradigm of what a human is. Now, just to finish this thought, the Gemara that continues and says, Antoninus asks Rabbi, which is always a nickname for Rabbi Judah the Prince, when does someone get a soul? When does someone get a neshama? Does it get it from conception or from the formation of the zygote? It's a couple of days later. So initially, Rabbi Judah the Prince says, from the formation. And then Antoninus responds, well, if you have a piece of meat and it just lies out there being unrefrigerated, it's going to spoil. Certainly, if you have any physicality and it doesn't have a spiritual component to it, it's automatically going to start to decompose. And indeed, Rabbi Judah the Prince responds, you're right. We actually get soul at conception, which is a big insight. Like, soul at conception, where do we learn that law? It comes from Antoninus. And Rabbi Judah the Prince agreed. And it's also, I think, a fantastic lesson that no physical, materialistic entity can exist outside of a spiritual force to keep it, to give it vitality. And the Gemara continues. When does someone get a Yetzer Hara? At what point in the development do you get a Yetzer Hara? So Rabbi Judah the Prince suggests that he gets it from the formation, which is early on in the gestation process, about 40 days. Says Antoninus, he says, no, if the child in utero already had a Yetzer Hara, then the kid would kick his mom, he wouldn't be happy being constricted, and he would force himself to be, to come out and would die. Now, Judah the Prince responds, you're right, and the child only gets the Yetzer Hara at birth. And it's really remarkable, like the foundational blocks of human conflict, where we have a soul and the Yetzer Hara that are counteracting each other, how that actually is built and how that's developed, that's learned from these debates that Rabbi Judah the Prince had with Antoninus. So as an example, we know the Talmud tells us a child in utero, he knows all of Torah. At birth, he forgets it all. Why? Well, what happens? Why does the child know of Torah? Why does he forget at birth? This is the answer. The child has a soul from conception. The soul innately knows Torah. So for the duration of the gestation, child knows Torah. There's nothing to stop the Torah. At birth, he gets the Yetzer Hara. Yetzer Hara overwhelms the soul, and its influence gets muted, and its effect, i.e. the Torah, gets forgotten. And thus the child at birth forgets Torah. This is really shows that the relationship that Rabbi Judah the Prince and Antoninus had was one of really sophisticated philosophical and theological debates, and their friendship and their mutual appreciation for Torah really laid the groundwork for the immense undertaking. I would venture to say the greatest collaborative scholastic effort in human history to be undertaken by Rabbi Judah the Prince and his people. So we have a lot of factors here. We have the relationship with the emperor, a lull, so to speak, in Roman hostilities to the Jewish people, immense personal wealth to fund the entire project, the unquestioned Torah leader and political leader of the Jewish people, And he undertook the project to write down the Mishnah, which to us, you want a Mishnah, you could buy one online from Amazon. You get the Kindle version for $2.99. But at that time, really meant entirely recreating the Jewish world. How so? There's a little background here. Oral Torah, we know that when the Almighty gave the Jewish people Torah, he gave them the entirety of Torah, which is an oral component and a written component as well. And in fact, when Moshe is teaching the Jewish people Torah for the duration of the 40 years, in the wilderness, he's teaching them primarily oral Torah. The written Torah, i.e. the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, that only appears at the end of the 40 years, at the end of Moshe's life. He writes 13 copies, he gives one to each tribe, and a 13th that was kept in posterity in the Ark. And the oral Torah is what does it mean? It means how to live as a Jew. Torah is the instructions of God. What does he expect from us? How are we to accomplish his will? How do we fulfill mitzvahs? All that is Torah, is the Almighty's instructions for us. And that was primarily given over in an oral format, i.e. parents tell their kids, okay, this is what you do as a Jew, this is what the holidays are, this is what Shabbos is, this is what tefillin looks like, this is how mezuzah is positioned, etc., etc. And the myriads of laws and behaviorisms as a Jew, that's part of the collected corpus of oral Torah. The written Torah indeed contains a condensed version of all of Torah, but it's condensed and encoded in a way that if you read the written Torah, you wouldn't necessarily know how to fulfill it. You'd read about on the holiday of Sukkot, we take a really beautiful fruit. Which one's that? Is it a pomegranate? Is it an apple? Is it an orange? You wouldn't know. It's hidden. It's encrypted. It's encoded. You wouldn't know what tefillin looked like, how to observe Shabbos, and all the myriads of laws of purity and impurity and sacrifices and all that you wouldn't know, because that's not the goal. The goal of written Torah is to have a skeletal outline of Torah, but also to have the capacity within it to cross-check and verify someone's oral Torah tradition. So we have a very complex structure of conveyance of Torah before Rabbi Judah the Prince. We have a written Torah, which is 5 books, 5,845 sentences. It's very fixed. And you want to make sure you pass it on without mistakes, but that's sort of easy. But then you have a coinciding body of knowledge that is voluminous. There's a tremendous amount of information that's never written down in a finalized, codified, canonized version, is passed on from parent to child, from teacher to student, from generation to generation. And all that is maintained in a very fluid way. People go to study in school, and they learn, and they memorize enormous amounts of information. All that's part of the oral Torah. And when the Jewish people are existing with stability, it's possible to do it. Every student, at a minimum, is sent to 14 years of tutelage under a great rabbi. And what do you do for 14 years? You study Torah for 14 to 18 hours a day. And you memorize enormous amounts of information. And by the way, what's the benefit of that? You have an entire nation that is groomed under tremendously rigorous conditions of intellectual achievement, and a nation that has bonds with previous generations. Whereas if you wanted to just be an average Jew, you don't want to be a great tzaddik. You want to be an average Jew. You want to just know what to do on Shabbos, you'd have to spend 14 years in study. That's what you have to do, just to know the basics. So just think about what a nation of geniuses we spawned because of the oral Torah. And this was all by design. In fact, I actually collected a list of reasons why the oral Torah had to be oral. Now, to be fair, parts of the oral Torah were written down, but it was never formalized, it was never publicized. It's actually forbidden for a teacher to teach a finalized, canonized text of oral Torah. Everyone kept notes for themselves, but you keep your notes, maybe you pass on some of your notes, but it's never published. It's never finalized. It's never, this is the oral Torah. No, oral Torah is oral. And I have a list here, just some examples why the oral Torah had to be oral. A, it's a better form of instruction. It's just, there's less room for mistakes. A written word, look at the Constitution. It's a written word, it's not so many words. And look how many disagreements we have mere 200 years after it's written. Obviously, when there is fixed rigidity in instruction, without allowance for inflection, and without taking care to ensure that mistakes aren't perpetuated, you're going to have diversity, which is very bad. It's very bad in the context of losing truth of Torah. There is a realm for diversity of Torah as well, but to have laws of Torah that are corrupted is a terrible thing. And oral Torah ensured that won't happen. Also principles. When you teach a principle, it's applied in many different areas. And that's much easier if the principles are malleable. Every generation has its own examples, right? If you look at idioms and parables and metaphors that are 250 years old, sometimes it's hard to see how that actually, the language changes and people's understandings of issues change. But if you are able to convey an oral principle without it being fixed, without being constrained to a finalized written format, you can ensure that the principle is able to take on different forms with every generation. Other examples, other reasons why the Torah was kept oral, to keep it out of the hands of Gentiles. It may sound controversial, but once the Torah was written down, the Gemara even tells us, that the Romans would send teams of investigators, of censors, to go to the yeshiva and study in yeshiva for decades. Why? Because they wanted to see if there's anything problematic with the Torah. The Gentiles are going to tell us what to do? They're going to tell us what to study. It's God's Torah. That doesn't even pass their censorship. But Torah is written down. And in fact, once the written Torah was translated into Greek by Ptolemy in the 3rd century before the Common Era, those are days of mourning. Because it's not a Jewish Torah. Anyone could go into artscroll.com or to Amazon and buy a copy of the Talmud now. And there's dozens of websites online today that are dedicated to taking the Talmud out of context and showing how the Jewish people are barbaric and they hate everyone, all nonsense. Well, that's what happens when you write down the oral Torah. And for all these reasons, and I have some more here, if the only way for Torah to be learned is total immersion in it, well, who rises to the top? The people that are most dedicated to it. So we're able to link scholarship and Torah knowledge and proficiency with Torah greatness. Because there's no way outside of the matrix for someone to just download information in their head. But once you have the written Torah, the oral Torah being written, it's somewhat of an equalizer, where you have someone who's not a Torah scholar, someone who is a Torah scholar, and there could be someone on a level playing field, which is bad because you can't separate who are the great Torah scholars of the generation. And there's many other benefits. I made a list of 10 here, just a few more. Jewish community. The only way for someone to study Torah, you can't study Torah in your basement. There's no way for someone to study. If the oral Torah is the only way we can learn, there's no way to do it unless you're part of a community. And that creates a dynamic religion where people know each other and they study from great scholars. And by the way, it's not just Torah. You study from a great scholar, you get to learn their mannerisms and their behaviorism. That's called Shimush Talmid Chacham. You're able to learn and emulate someone who's a great Torah scholar. If you have the idiot's guide to the oral Torah in your basement, you're sitting there eating Cheetos and drinking Diet Coke, and you're studying Torah. And that's great. I understand it is great. But it's a step down of the instruction you get in an environment that totally exudes Torah and Torah ideals. And lastly, I think this is also very important. Having an oral Torah as the only means of conveyance of Torah does not allow any room for failure. We cannot say, oh, as a generation, we're going to take a generation off. We're going to we're going to opt out from intensive Torah study for one generation. You can't, because you do that, oral Torah will be forgotten. There's no document you could say, we'll pass it on to the next generation when they'll study it, and Torah will continue. So that essentially demanded from the Jewish nation as a whole, over the 1400 years when the oral Torah was entirely oral, it demanded that they never took their foot off the gas. They never had complacency. They never said, "Oh, we'll worry about the Torah in 10 years." No, you can't take any time off, and that's what they might have really wanted, for us to be totally engaged in Torah and pursuit of greatness. But there was a problem. The problem is that, we spoke about it in recent weeks. The Romans and the dispersal of the Jewish people, the prohibition against Torah study, and certainly public Torah study, the conditions were really lacking for oral Torah to continue. Maimonides tells us, he gives an example. He says sometimes someone has gangrene on their legs. What do? How do you save the person? You got to cut off the leg. Which doctor, which physician is going to cut off a leg of a patient? Well, the answer is, if that's the only way to save them, that's the only option you have. Rabbi Judah the Prince, in his position, with all the factors at play, he made the calculation that we have to amputate, so to speak. We have to do the unthinkable, to gather all the scholars together, to gather all the oral Torah traditions together, to take all the notes from previous generations, to put our heads together and figure out a finalized, authoritative, codified, and canonized book of Mishnah, of oral Torah, because otherwise Torah may be forgotten. In fact, the example or the verse that we give for this is Eis la'asot la'Hashem efir Toratecha. It's a time for action for God, because otherwise Torah will be destroyed. Maimonides tells us, why did Rabbi Judah the Prince, this is a quote from his introduction to his book, Yad Chazaka. Why did Rabbi Judah the Prince write down the Mishnah and not leave it the way it was? What was wrong with the preceding 1,500 years of Jewish history? Because he saw that students were becoming fewer and fewer. There was a diminishing in the total numbers of students. Calamities were happening all the time. The wicked government, which is a reference to Rome, was extending its domain and increasing its power, and the Jews were wandering and reaching far and remote places. The Jewish people were becoming more decentralized and having more restrictions on Torah study. He thus wrote a work that serves as a handbook for all, so it could be rapidly studied and would not be forgotten, and they created the Mishnah and ensured that the Torah would not be forgotten. Rabbi Judah the Prince, in Jewish writings and Jewish literature, is sometimes called Rabbi. Why is he called Rabbi with the moniker Rabbi? Because he truly is the Rabbi of the Jewish people, specifically for this contribution. He undertook, he made a decision. Can you imagine? Right? Going against 1,500 years of tradition, especially in a nation that is obsessed with tradition. But he made the calculation, and we exist thanks to that decision to amputate the leg, to go against the Torah, to save the Torah, and to write down the Mishnah. The scale of the Mishnah is unfathomable, it's monumental. It's 63 books, broken down into 6 different sections. A section talks about agricultural law, a section that talks about holidays, a section that talks about marriage and divorce, damages, interpersonal law, and purity, very complex and vast laws about purity and impurity, and a section that talks about sacrifices, sacrificial law. All that in collaboration with legitimately thousands of rabbis, written in an unbelievable way, very tersely. It's just astonishing how he managed to capture the flavor of oral Torah in a written format. It's unbelievable. Just that on its own really gives you a sense of the greatness of him and his team. He knew all the reasons why oral Torah was oral. All the benefits of oral Torah he knew very well. But he had a problem, he had to write it down. So he managed to write it in a way that doesn't compromise the reasons why it was initially oral. So for example, he wrote it in shorthand almost. He didn't elaborate it. So you have a Mishnah, you have the law, but like the written Torah, it's just a skeletal outline of oral Torah. In order to really understand it, you'd still need to have a teacher. You'd still need to spend your time in the houses of scholarship. And that's why afterwards you wonder, if the Mishnah was written down, why do we have to have Talmud and Midrash and Halacha, all these other works that came afterwards? Because he specifically avoided writing it all down because that would compromise the reasons why it was initially oral. He succeeded in reshaping Jewish life. The work of the Mishnah is a work that was studied for hundreds of years by the most intelligent people around to try to draw from it its lessons. Not only that, the Mishnah itself was also memorized. He took an existing body of oral Torah that was memorized. He wrote down a Mishnah. The Mishnah itself was memorized as well. So for example, it's a really remarkable notion here. The Talmud sometimes tells us, the Talmud is the book that came after the Mishnah. The Talmud tells us that sometimes when it's analyzing a Mishnah, it would say, Chisuri michsara v'hachiktani. The words of the Mishnah are missing, which is strange. Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote the Mishnah. Why would the words of the Mishnah be missing? Seems really bizarre. So one answer is that, well, he wrote it in a way, in like a stanza format, so people could sing it. So sometimes when there's some extra words, they cut off those extra words to make it rhyme, which is a strange idea, but someone says that. But the real answer is because he wanted to write it in an imperfect manner. Because you read a Mishnah, and it doesn't make any sense. Obviously, it doesn't make any sense. And the only way to understand it is if it's lacking words. It's really, in the true version, it should have said more words. But he was able to convey that necessity for adding words. Think about that. He wrote a Mishnah in shorthand version, which mandated that you would know as a reader, if you would truly analyze it, you would know there's something missing and what those missing words are. Well, the only way you would do that is if you actually concentrated in a tremendous degree. So he managed to really capture the oral Torah because you'd study it and he said, wait a minute, there's obvious questions. It must be lacking words. And you know what? You're right. Well, why did he do it like that? He did it by design. All that's by design. Him and his team, they get together. We want the people who read this to be confounded. And the only way to do it, they have to ask their teacher, they have to study, they have to analyze further and further, and thus the flavor of Torah is maintained. He had another nickname. His nickname was our holy teacher, because he manifested, along with his outstanding scholarship, scintillating personal character and holiness. The Gemara tells us that someone asked him, I think this will be surprising for people today. Someone asked him, why does everyone call you Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy teacher? He really had a lot of nicknames, right? Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi, and our holy. Why is he called our holy teacher? And it's evident from the story he was called like that during his lifetime. And he tells them, in my entire life, I never looked at my circumcision, never once. Alternatively, he never let his hands go beneath his belt. Never in his life. He always held his hand like this. He was in total control of his limbs. Total mindfulness to never allow his hands to move in a way that wasn't perfectly choreographed, which is unthinkable for us. We can't really even grasp the kind of personal self-control that would demand. The Gemara says that when he was about to die, there's a lot of stories about what happened when he's about to die. He was about to die, he took his hands and he lifted them in the air, and he said, these 10 fingers, you should know that all I did with these 10 fingers was study Torah. And I may have been the wealthiest person around, I didn't even benefit from my wealth, even the amount of a single pinky. No. It was all, everything, his entire life was dedicated to God. The Gemara tells, he was sick. And the people were devastated because they knew he was on his deathbed, but the notion of losing such a person was unthinkable to them. So they announced, if anyone declares that Rabbi Judah the Prince died, we're going to take a sword and slash them. We're going to kill him with a sword. Which, if you think about that, that's a nice threat. So what does everyone do? No one wants to get slashed with a sword. Everyone starts praying. And Rabbi Judah the Prince is dying, but everyone's keeping him alive because the entire Jewish nation has accepted upon themselves total commitment to pray. And he's, so to speak, torn. On one hand, the heavens, so to speak, they want him. The angels and God, they want him, and they're trying to pull him up. And the Jewish people, everyone's praying together, no, don't take him, and he's just kind of hanging in balance. So his maidservant, he had someone who worked in his house, he had a big bustling household. She went on top of the roof, and she saw he was in suffering. And she took a glass vessel, and she dropped it off the roof, and it made a big shattering sound, and everyone stopped praying for a second, then he died. His lesson, just a remarkable lesson, just a quick lesson that he taught in the Pirkei Avos, in Chapters of the Fathers. He instructed, "Havizar b'mitzvah kavachamor." You have to be careful with even a minor mitzvah as you would a major mitzvah. We have a tendency to assign hierarchy. Well, this is an important mitzvah. Yom Kippur, it's important. Every other mitzvah, wearing tefillin on a Tuesday, not so important. He says, no, you don't know the value of any mitzvah. We have to, if the mitzvah is an action that the Almighty tells us to do, we have to value it as if it's what it is, which is an instruction from God. How can you say, well, this instruction from God, this I'm going to keep, everything? How do you say that? And he says you should also calculate the loss of a mitzvah with the benefit of a mitzvah. How much pain does it cost you to do a mitzvah? Oh, so much pain, right? Oh, gosh, really, it's not so much. But what do you gain from doing a single mitzvah? You gain eternity. You gain a place in Olam Haba. How could you just do the calculation? It's a simple cost basis, a cost analysis, and just do the math, and all you do is mitzvahs. And similarly, you want to sin. Okay, well, you get a benefit. It's a lot of pleasure to sin. But what's it going to cost you? For one sin, you taint your soul for eternity. How could you possibly make that calculation and say, I'm going to sin and I'll benefit? No, it's illogical. And lastly, he says, look at 3 things, examine 3 ideas, and you'll never sin. You should know what's above you. A seeing eye, a hearing ear, and all your actions are written in a book. Everything we do, the Almighty keeps track of. And like we learned from Rabbi Judah the Prince all the way at the beginning, we're here, we got a body and a soul, we get the blind guard and the lame guard, and we're looking at the trees and they look so luscious to us, and we want to partake, we want to indulge. But you should know that the Almighty says no. And it would be insane, the trade-off is illogical to say, I want to have this fruit, so to speak, when you know that the Almighty is coming back and He's beckoning. Everything's being written down. There's no way to escape it. The Talmud leaves a remarkable eulogy for him. And it says, when Rabbi Judah the Prince died, there was no more people of humility and fear of sin. Clearly we see, despite the fact that he was the wealthiest person around, he didn't benefit from it. He was a very collaborative Torah scholar. He always tried to see the opinion of other people. We see even when Antoninus came. Antoninus is a non-Jew. He's arguing with the rabbi. He should wipe the floor with him. But Antoninus says something that he agrees with. He says, you know what, you're right, and I'm wrong, and this law I learned from Antoninus. An unbelievable humility that he demonstrated. And, of course, fear of sin. To him, the sin was just so palpable, and the negative impacts of a sin were so devastating that would be totally ridiculous. Like, how could you possibly make the calculation that it's worth to do? Indeed, Rabbi Judah the Prince is forever enshrined in Jewish life and Jewish history because of his greatness, of course, his personal greatness, his greatness in Torah, but most of all, his decision may have been controversial at this time, who knows, but his decision to take all of oral Torah with all its complexities, with the vastness of its laws, to write it down in the Mishnah in a remarkable way, and to ensure that Torah gets perpetuated. That was the theme of the whole century. The whole century was great Torah scholars and great Torah leaders to ensure that the Jewish people will continue. I'll see you guys next week. Any questions? You had a question there. Go ahead. I'm sorry?
Now two that you finished. The first one is, how did you compare him to Moshe Rabbeinu?
I can't, but the Talmud could.
Okay. How did the Talmud? How did they?
Well,
How did they do it?
well, the way. What do you mean? What do you mean the way? How does it do it?
Yeah, because like Moshe Rabbeinu was like one of a kind.
Yeah, that's true. But in his generation, he was the Moshe of his generation.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that he was as great as Moshe, but it means that Moshe taught the Jewish people, he taught the Jewish people. Moshe was humble, he was humble. Of course, he's not as great as Moshe, no one's as great as Moshe. But in his generation, he was the Moshe of his generation.
Okay.
And specifically with regard to being the absolute leader of the Jewish people, just like Moshe was, he was in his time as well.
What years are we talking about?
We're talking, he must have been born in the 130s, sometime the 130s. And I don't know exactly when he died, but it's in the 3rd century, maybe 217. I think the number that I remember is 217.
I have a question. I mean, he did something that was very, like you gave the analogy of the amputation. Knowing
Rambam.
how there was always a lot of discussion amongst scholars, is there documentation or writing about the fact that there must have been people who disagreed with what he did? You know,
It's interesting because there is, yes.
People for doing what he did.
It's really surprising because there really isn't a lot of sources that describe the writing of the Talmud, and I think the reason why there's such scant details about the process of the writing of the Mishnah is because all of the Jewish people accepted it as authoritative. And therefore, it's almost as if it came down from Sinai. Like, we don't know how it came down from Sinai, but it's here, and it's from God, and it's finalized.
So like
and
everybody was behind this whole effort.
Yeah,
is
there
what
might
you're
have
saying.
there might have been debate. You would imagine there would have been
I
debate,
couldn't imagine there wouldn't have been.
right?
You know,
Especially something so innovative and
Yeah.
creative.
exactly.
But once the debate was settled, and it was of national importance to have it being unquestioned, we don't discuss the debate because it's immaterial. There may have been debate at its time. You would imagine there was was there debate when the Shulchan Aruch was written? Maybe, but we don't know of it. It's
Yeah, I
irrelevant
thought
because the
about that
Shulchan
too,
Aruch was
because that
accepted
goes-
by the Jewish people as the word of halach, final word of halacha, and therefore it doesn't really matter. Like that part is always going to be, it's going to be lower in just the importance.
Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch is the accepted in today, and this is what we follow. This is what,
Yeah. Well, that's already a much lower level of halacha,
Yeah.
right? There's the Mishnah, and there's the Talmud,
Yeah.
there's halacha in the form of the different
So-
Rishonim, and then
yeah.
Shulchan Aruch is the finalized for us.
so before that was the Mishnah Torah.
Yes, the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah as well. That would be.
So if you say you want to do something in the Mishnah Torah,
Yeah.
but it's not in the Shulchan Aruch, as far as like
We as Jews today, we're subject to the Shulchan Aruch. So when he disagrees in the Rambam, we follow him.
But do you have a choice?
Well, if you're Yemenite, then yes, the Yemenite community accepted the Rambam Mishnah Torah as the finalized word, so they would go with him even if he disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch. But for us, no. Shulchan Aruch is the finalized word.
Between the Talmud and the Mishnah.
Yes, the Talmud and the Mishnah are sister works. The Talmud is based upon the Mishnah. But the Talmud is filling in the gaps that Rabbi Judah the Prince kept out. That's the idea. Because the Mishnah is very terse. So the Talmud is going to fill in all those gaps and like, what's the source? And they're bringing, like, just really elaboration on the Mishnah.
So the Talmud.
It's built upon it. It's the next layer of oral Torah that was written for the same, very same reasons. Because the Jewish people became even more spread out, and scholarship also dwindled, and therefore the next logical step was to write down the Talmud as well. And then halacha is the next step.
And that's Rabbi.
That's like the Rambam. He was the first to really do a total recreation of halacha. Well, one of the first. But that era is when they start rewriting halacha, which is extracting from Talmud practical law.
And he was really trashed by a lot of rabbis for doing that.
Yes, it wasn't so, yes,
Yeah, I
yes,
mean,
that's right.
there was a lot of controversy.
Next week, we're going to discuss some of the great Amoraim. Once Rabbi Judah the Prince writes down the Mishnah, it's an entirely different
What was he?
reality. Huh?
What was he, a Rishon?
He was a Tana.
Tana.
Tana is the author of the Mishnah. But he's at the end. The Mishnah is now sealed, and now all the scholarship is already working from the Mishnah as a starting point. Just like he worked from the written Torah is fixed, Mishnah is now fixed as well.
Do you know the name of the volume of the Talmud that talk about the Rabbi, the Yehuda Hanavi, and Antonina?
Yeah, that would be Sanhedrin. Well, there's two major Gemaras. There's one in Sanhedrin on page 91 and one in Avodah Zarah, page 10. Those are the two major sources that discuss it. There's other sources as well, but those are the two major ones. This is in the Talmud, Avodah Zarah 10 and Sanhedrin 91.
What about, you said, at the time, there were less students.
Diminishing, it was diminishing.
Do we know why there were less students?
Well, because a lot of the rabbis were assassinated, and a lot of the people went underground. People were scared to study. The Romans caused dispersal. People left. The Torah centers were less densely populated. All those reasons contributed to this.
Marcus Aurelius Anthony, is that?
Yes, same person. Marcus Aurelius Anthonius is his full name. Okay, I'll see everyone next week.
Okay, all right.